Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. As you can see, we are back in the studio, and I also have 4 interesting McLeod County historical stories to share for you, as well as some updates on what's going on at the museum and what's coming up. So stay tuned and enjoy the show. So this first story I'm going to share with you is about a young man named Samuel DeWing, who had initially settled in Meeker County, but then made his way to Hutchinson. And in a letter to the Hutchinson leader back in 1920, he kind of described how the landscape in the town was so much different back in the 1860s than it was in the 1920s. And so I kind of put all that together and made a little story for you. So I hope you enjoy this one. The ink was scarcely dry on the Homestead Act, yet thousands of farmers raced to settle on the cheap yet viable land now available in the United States. It was 1862, and one of those young men of 22 years was named Samuel DeWing. He, along with his parents, found a corner of the world to stake a claim. As a young man, however, Sam looked to make his own way in life. After several months in Collinwood in Meeker County, Minnesota, the young Mr. DeWing set south to make it on his own. In August of 1862, Samuel DeWing found himself in Hutchinson, Minnesota. The land looked attractive enough, yet trouble was brewing on the horizon. News had only just reached the town of the murders in Acton, Minnesota. It was an act that set off a firestorm and led to all-out war between white settlers and the Native Americans on the reservation. Sam volunteered his service to the Hutchinson Home Guard and later acted as a scout until November of that same year, at which he returned to his parents' farm in Meeker County. 2 years later, with the war long since over, Sam again found himself near Hutchinson. This time, however, he planned to stake his own claim. Hutchinson looked far different at the time. Main Street was a dirt road, muddy in wet weather and dusty when dry. Alongside was a handful of buildings made mostly of logs, and occupying them were less than 70 people, around 60 in today's standards. The sea of land that surrounded the little hamlet was wild. The Crow River ran through town. South of the riverbanks was a plain in which the town rested, and to the north was a heavily timbered grove, impenetrable by road or trail. The young Mr. DeWing staked his claim on 230 acres on the northernmost portion of Section 6 in the Hutchinson Township range. Though his intentions were to farm, it would be some time before he ever sowed a seed. During those first years in the area, Sam DeWing lived as a hunter and a trapper. Meat and fur were his chief crops. Though the buffalo and elk had all but vanished from the region, the woods and prairies still abounded with an assortment of wild game animals. White-tailed deer were easy targets for the early settlers. Fish and fowl could easily be found on the lakes. Mink, otter, and muskrat swarmed the sloughs, and raccoons still stalked the edge of the big woods. In all, a woodsman could easily find enough food to feed himself through the year. Sam lived off the land for the first few years, yet during that time he cleared land and built a respectable farmstead. In 1868, he married Louisa Huffman. The couple would go on to have 6 children. The eldest son, Arthur, would later go on to inherit the farm. Samuel DeWing passed away in April of 1920. Before he passed, however, he took the time to reflect on his life in early Hutchinson. When he sold the farm to his son in 1910, the land had changed dramatically. Though hardwood groves still dotted the prairie, they had thinned some, and roads made it easy to travel around the back country. Sam would often reminisce how on the very road where gas wagons, as he would refer to cars, passed his old home, there was nary even a footpath that led through the woods to his farm when he was younger. And how on that same road there once was a deer pass, where he had shot more deer than most young people had ever seen in their lives. The pioneers that settled McLeod County were certainly a hardy bunch. Their hard work and dedication to the land laid a tough foundation that withstood the many obstacles that time has thrown at it. They were a people unlike many others, sturdy, steadfast, and with a great desire to build a world that would last long into the future. All right, so this next story is about a young man named Henry Beneke who began walking to Minnesota from Illinois when he was 11 years old. So sit back and enjoy this story about one of the old-time walkers of McLeod County. Everybody loves a good walk, especially this time of year. The fresh air, birds singing, warm sunshine, and the smells of summer make July and August a splendid time for a walk. Few things in life allow a person to lose themselves in quiet thought, such as a nice long walk. It's great for your health, and it's good for the soul. Over the years, walking has gained popularity as a pleasurable activity. Put simply, we walk for fun. So much that specialized clothing and footwear is designed for pleasure walking in mind. In the past, however, a long walk wasn't always something seen as a recreational activity. In fact, if you were to travel back 150 years, a walk was not necessarily something to be enjoyed, but a key mode of transportation, and highly likely not looked upon as an enjoyable activity like it is today. Few know the arduous task of a long walk such as the Pioneer. At a time when railroads had yet to stretch across much of the continent, a great many immigrants walked across the country to find their new homes. Much of the walking was done in the wilderness, over rough terrain, where roads were non-existent. One such pioneer who trekked across the countryside on foot was an old Glencoe settler named Henry F. Beneke. The year was 1858, and Henry Beneke was a boy of 11 years. He was born in Hanover, Germany in 1847, and came to America with his father and two sisters in 1857. They initially located in Illinois, but his family headed to Minnesota, leaving Henry and one sister behind until they were sent for. In 1858, they were called upon to join the rest of the family in Minnesota. They went on with a party of settlers traveling north that spring. In the party were 11 settlers with 3 prairie schooners pulled by oxen. As the crow flies, it was a journey of about 375 miles. Henry and his sister walked the entire trip. "We spent 8 weeks on the road," said Henry, "losing several days waiting for bridges that had been washed out to be repaired. We camped out most of the time, and I certainly enjoyed it, although I did get tired of walking sometimes. We crossed the Mississippi at Dubuque and came up overland to Carver. I found my father, my stepmother, and younger sister who had arrived the year before. They were nicely settled in a cabin on my father's claim." Henry's experience as a walker did not end once he reached Minnesota. In fact, if one were to calculate how much travel Henry did on foot, the results would be staggering. On his father's claim, Henry spent endless days walking behind an ox that was pulling a plow, walking into the settlement for supplies, and walking alongside oxen as he made supply runs to and from Minneapolis. He figured that he had, at a minimum, and maybe with a bit of exaggeration, walked such a great distance that it would have equaled a person walking 10 times around the world. Henry would eventually move off his father's claim and begin a life of his own in Glencoe Township. He married in 1873 to Gertrude Klompkin, and the couple had 6 children. In 1884, Gertrude died, leaving Henry to raise the children on his own. In 1929, at the age of 82 years old, Henry died. A year prior, he gave an interview to the now-defunct Glencoe Enterprise where he reminisced not only on his trip to Minnesota as a child, but all the walking he'd done in his life. "That was a good many years ago," the old pioneer proclaimed, "and I have done a great deal of walking since. If some of those young fellows who are now trying to beat each other on foot in the races across the country had followed me during the last 70 years, I don't think they would be doing much walking now. All I can say is I sure hope Henry had a good pair of shoes." So this next story is about one of the McLeod County sheriffs who sat in office from 1938 to 1947. His name was Sheriff Arthur Tessmer, and you'll find through the story that he was a lot like Andy Griffith from the Andy Griffith Show, or Andy Taylor, I should say, the sheriff of Mayberry. He didn't like to carry a gun, and he was very lax with his prisoners. He sheriffed like a neighbor instead of like a policeman. So sit back and enjoy. This is one of my favorites. Through the span of 1938 to 1947, McLeod County was a hub of rural life. The communities were small, neighbors were treated like family, and the difference between right and wrong was often as stark as black and white. People were still feeling the effects of the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and were faced with yet another world war. It was the perfect time and the perfect place for a man named Arthur G. Tessmer to occupy the McLeod County Sheriff's Office. Art Tessmer was a country boy, to say the least. Quiet, well-liked, and fair. He was born in 1895 and grew up on a farm by Stewart, Minnesota, and later farmed near Hutchinson. He had a fondness for horses, both riding and watching. He loved the smell of freshly mowed hay, and he had a keen eye for livestock. In addition to that, he was an avid hunter and a fisherman. In 1920, he married Alma Hutchinson of Hutchinson. The two began raising a family, 3 daughters in all. Later, the family moved to Hutchinson, where Arthur operated a feed mill and began acquainting himself with the local farmers in the county. He would drive to their farms and grind feed for their livestock. Though his background was on the farm, Arthur decided farming was not for him. So in 1938, he ran for sheriff of McLeod County, which he won. In January of 1939, Sheriff Tessmer and his family moved from Hutchinson to the sheriff's quarters in Glencoe, a small apartment that shared a wall with the county jail. "Dad rarely carried a gun," remarked Harriet Dwyer, Tessmer's daughter. Now, one could argue that it was because times were different and crime was lower. Yet it may well have been that Sheriff Tessmer wanted folks to respect the badge he wore and the law he represented, rather than the gun on his hip. If that was his aim, it certainly rang true for several of the people incarcerated under Tessmer's eye. Sheriff Tessmer was one to believe that the worst people in this world are not always locked up in a jail cell, and that sometimes all people need are a second chance. Often, the prisoners were friends of Art, arrested for non-threatening crimes like public drunkenness or check forgery. Prisoners that Art knew or trusted were allowed outside their cells to help with household chores like cutting grass. In many cases, prisoners kept in touch with Tessmer and his family after they'd left McLeod County, many writing to the sheriff while they were away fighting in World War II. Art Tessmer may have had a tranquil style of sheriffing, but he was also capable of laying down the law with force if necessary. In December of 1945, the sheriff's office was notified of an ex-convict and wanted murderer lurking somewhere in McLeod County. His name was George Sitz, and he was wanted for an armed robbery of a liquor store and the murder of the clerk on duty. Sitz had made his way to the Glencoe area and secured employment with the Farmers and Merchants Milling Company. Eventually, the manager of the plant recognized Sitz from a newspaper article and alerted Sheriff Tessmer. Under the cover of darkness, Sheriff Tessmer and his crew of deputies took to the road to intercept Sitz while he was riding along Highway 22 in a company truck on a return trip from Annandale. They chose not to take the patrol car for fear that the flashing lights would set off Sitz. So instead, they took Art's pickup truck. They waited for the truck to come into the view, blinked their headlights, and waited for the truck to stop. Art instructed one of his deputies to approach the truck and act like he's drunk. While the driver and Sitz had their eyes on the drunk motorist, Sheriff Tessmer snuck over to the passenger side of the truck and made his move. Sitz was concealing a .45 and began to resist. But this time Sheriff Tessmer was carrying a gun of his own and quickly pulled it on the fugitive, who immediately gave up. That night, with Sitz sitting in the county jail, Sheriff Tessmer recounted the tale to a kitchen full of neighbors who all sipped coffee made by Mrs. Tessmer. 1947 would be the sheriff's last year in office. Despite his popularity and cunning capture of a wanted fugitive, he lost the election to Otto Gruenhagen. The family was forced to move from the apartment, and Arthur had to go back to livestock trading. In 1961, Arthur's heart gave out on a hot day in July at his lake cabin on Lake Marion. Today, we live in an era where police are often questioned and scrutinized. It's important to remember officers like Sheriff Tessmer. Though his time in the sun ended long ago, there are still many in law enforcement who exemplify the qualities of the small-town sheriff. Perhaps rather than complicated overhauls of police tactics, We should instead be studying the history of men like Tessmer, officers who acted a little more like Andy and a little less like Bart. So this next story is about Abby Pendergast. She was the wife of one of the town's founders, William Wirt Pendergast, and her story was about being in the Stockade during the attack on Hutchinson in 1862 and watching the town burn. The kind of interesting thing in there was when she watched her own home burn, they had hid a bunch of stuff in the cellar, and the house toppled down on top of the cellar, and none of the items were ever retrieved, or at least we don't know if they were ever retrieved. But at any rate, sit back and enjoy this one, as it too is one of my favorites. Mrs. Abby Pendergast peered through a porthole in the wall of the stockade, witnessing with horror the destruction of the town she called home. The year was 1862, and the settlement was Hutchinson. A modest collection of wooden shanties and log cabins sprawled across the southwest banks of the Crow River. For weeks, the townspeople were on edge. News that the Dakota Sioux war parties were attacking families and settlements in the region was widespread. Terrified that Hutchinson would soon be targeted, a stockade was erected for the safety of the settlers in and around the community. Finally, on September 4th, a war party led by Little Crow commenced to attacking the town. Mrs. Pendergast's eyes scanned the scene. Much of the town was in flames. The attackers moved from building to building, looting their contents, then tossing torches through the windows, all the while being careful not to get too close to the stockade for fear of drawing gunfire by the home guards. As she scanned, she saw warriors surround the Pendergast Academy, set fire to it, and ring the large bell until the flames finally broke the rope it was attached to, and the ball came crashing to the ground. Abby strained to see more from the limits of the little porthole. Flames grew from the windows and doorways of buildings, large flames that sent black smoke curling through the blue sky overhead. As she scanned, she watched with horror as a group of warriors made their way to the home of her and Mr. William Wirt Pendergast. Torches were thrown through the windows and on top of the roof. In a matter of minutes, the entire building went up in flames. Abby watched and was in tears as the home crumpled into a heap. Her heart sank, not for the loss of a home that could be rebuilt, but the loss of many prized possessions that were hidden away in the cellar. Many of them were wedding presents, including a fine set of china dishes. All of it was gone, however, buried beneath a hulk of burning debris, and they were all irretrievable. The aftermath was dreadful. All but one home, the Harrington Merrill house, had been destroyed. Of those taking refuge in the stockade, most had no homes to return to and were forced to live in the confines of the fort throughout the winter. When spring came, most were able to leave the fort and build new homes. The Pendergasts moved into a new home that William Wirt built himself. They lived there for nearly 50 years, only a stone throw from their old home that was burnt in 1862. The old house was marked with a marker on top of the old cellar that was beneath it. In 1916, C.J. Martinson began excavating for a home on the former lot of the Pendergast house and covered all traces of the old cellar. Later in life, Mrs. Pendergast would often remark to people that if they wanted to find artifacts from the Dakota War, they had only to find the remains of the cellar and start digging. There they would find the remains of her fine china set, as well as other items of personal belonging. To this day, it's unknown if any was ever recovered. All right, so hope you enjoyed the stories. Now for a little bit of museum news. First of all, we are open Monday through Friday from 10 to 4 and Saturday from 1 to 4. Despite the pandemic, we are open. We're at 50% capacity. You don't need to wear a mask if you come in. If you want to, feel free to do so, but we aren't going to force you to. And also just a little bit of an update, we have put a hold on our fundraisers and events for the year. The only event we are doing is our Tuesday morning breakfast club, and that is always on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 10:30 a.m. So we will be holding one in July and August, unless something changes. We did unfortunately have to cancel the pork chop supper, and it's not looking likely that we'll hold it this year due to all the restrictions with food service related to COVID-19. As you've probably heard, the McLeod County Fair has been canceled, so we won't be at the fair this year, but look for us to come back next year. Last but not least is our popular Christmas gala that we were planning on carrying over from last year. Right now that's still up in the air. We don't know what we're going to do, so kind of just stay tuned and just keep watching our website or Facebook for any updates on the gala coming up if you were looking forward to it this year. Other than that, those are the big news items I have for you this month, so I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you tune in again next month for another episode of History Quest.